Welcome everyone to the annual Silas Peirce Lecture, both the in-person audience and the online audience. This is part of the annual Arts and Sciences Endowed Lecture Series. This lecture series was made possible by the Silas Peirce Fund, established by the heirs of Silas Peirce, treasurer of Boston University from 1911 to 1922, and Boston University trustee from 1899 to 1922. So imagine a person making a gift that impacts us today with a lecture series that has been going on for so many generations of BU students and arts and sciences students. This lecture is open to all fields of inquiry in the college. These lectures demonstrate how our arts and sciences mindset considers multiple disciplinary perspectives in finding answers to important questions. Past topics have included bias, sustainability, data science of baseball, gender, and the possibility of water on Mars. Last year's lecture explored misinformation in social media and how to fight it. Our annual lectures bring our college community together across disciplines and colleges and bring together interested faculty, students, alumni, and parents from around the nation and around the world. Tonight, we are fortunate to have two preeminent speakers with us to talk about a fascinating interdisciplinary topic, curiosity and the architecture of thought. As we will hear, Dr. Dani Bassett and Dr. Peirce Zurn will discuss the philosophy and science behind curiosity. Our moderator, Professor Rachel Dennison, assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences, will introduce our speakers in greater detail. Rachel Dennison is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. Her lab studies visual perception, attention, and decision-making with a focus on temporal dynamics. So imagine you are observing the world visually and you're making decisions every moment about what to do in the world. You're deciding where to focus your attention visually, and where you're focusing attention actually influences the kinds of decisions and when you make them through time. That's the type of research that's going on in Dr. Dennison's lab. Our speakers will address questions like this tonight: how our minds move when we wonder, question, and inquire. Please welcome Professor Dennison to the stage to introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Stan, and welcome to everyone who's here and who's viewing online. So it is my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Dani Bassett and Dr. Peirce Zurn. Dr. Zurn is Provost Associate Professor of Philosophy at American University and affiliate faculty in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, and Culture Studies and the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. He researches in political philosophy, critical theory, trans theory, and LGBTQ studies, and collaborates in psychology and network neuroscience. Dr. Zurn is the author of the books Curiosity and Power, The Politics of Inquiry, and How We Make Each Other, Trans Life at the Edge of the University. He has also co-edited multiple books and authored more than 90 publications in philosophy, political theory, queer and trans theory, and network science. Dr. Bassett is the J. Peter Skirkanich Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with appointments in the departments of bioengineering, physics and astronomy, electrical and systems engineering, neurology, and psychiatry, as well as an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. Dr. Bassett studies the structure and function of networks in physical and biological systems, and is known for blending neural and systems engineering to identify fundamental mechanisms of cognition and disease in human brain networks. And they are a fellow of the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering and the American Physical Society, and have received many prestigious awards, including a MacArthur Fellow Genius Grant. So Dr. Bassett and Dr. Zurn are identical twins with a long history of academic collaboration, including their recent book, Curious Minds, The Power of connection. So please help me welcome them to give this year's Silas Peirce lecture on curiosity and the architecture of thought.
Thank you so much for the introductions. We're excited to be with you all here today to talk about our work. So that should not be the end of the slide deck. Hold on just a second. So there we go. So I am Dani, and I am at the University of Pennsylvania with an affiliation with the Santa Fe Institute and also more recently with McGill University in Montreal.
And I'm Zurn. I'm a professor at American University, but I'm also currently working at Cornell.
And what we want to do over the next couple of minutes is to tell you about curiosity, its science and philosophy, and we'll separate our communication into 3 sections. We'll begin with what is curiosity. We want to start with a historical perspective and then move on to the new vantage point that we think can come from blending philosophy and science. And then we'll turn to understanding curiosity in the natural and artificial wild. So we'll talk about curious styles in people around the world and then also in artificial intelligence. In the final section, we want to turn to some implications for this work in the context of society at large, and also more specifically in social justice. We'll talk a little bit about pedagogy, education, and the curriculum in the classroom, as well as what this does for, or helps us to think about in terms of academic practice. So I'll turn it over first to Perry.
So what is curiosity? You may already think that it's kind of a love of trivia, maybe. You know, a really curious person is interested in lots of strange pieces of information. It might be that you think a curious person is marked by how many questions they ask, kind of the irrepressibility of their question asking. Or maybe it's just someone who's constantly raising their hand, although we know that that has its limits in the classroom, right? Here are, I'm not sure what to do next. There we go. Okay, just wait for it. Here are some traditional definitions of curiosity. So if you're talking about, again, I'm a philosopher, I'm coming from an intellectual history tradition. Here are some traditional definitions. Curiosity is a lust to experience and find out. That's St. Augustine in 397. Or curiosity is the desire to know. That's more commonly used today. That's from Aquinas, started with Aquinas in 1270. Curiosity is a desire to understand, from Descartes in 1649. Curiosity is an appetite after knowledge. That's John Locke, 1693. Curiosity is the impulse toward better cognition. It seems like everyone's trying to get to the same point here. This is William James, 1899. Curiosity is a motivational prerequisite for exploratory behavior. That's Henry Voss. So we're starting to hear psychology coming in there with the motivation and the exploratory behavior. And then curiosity is a feeling of deprivation produced by an information gap. Like I need to know something and I feel deprived if I don't know it. That's Lowenstein in 1994. These are all really helpful definitions. They have been helpful not only for psychology, in which much of the study of curiosity has taken place, but also across a variety of disciplines, literatures, histories, etc. However, I want to get, as a philosopher, I want to get like underneath this. Notice some of the similar structuring in these definitions, and I'm going to pull it out here. But you have curiosity is, then it's usually a lust, desire, appetite, right, to do what? Simplistically, we have someone, a person, right, who wants to know something. They have some drive to get the thing that they want to know, and that thing that they want to know has some discrete features in advance. Okay? If we want to, again, pull apart theoretically those definitions there, we have words like the individual or the subject or the person or the human or the organism is the curious being. And it'd be interesting to think about, and we'll push this a little bit later, but what are the limits of the curious being? Can robots be curious? What can birds be curious, right? Is the earth curious? I mean, you know, it's an interesting question. So, but some curious being Then there's some drive, some impetus, and we have a long list of ways we've talked about that really reflect particular moments in history and what the discourse was at the time. Desire from Augustine, that's really rooted in the theological tradition. But when we get to motivation or we get to drive state, again, that's situated primarily in psychology. And then there's this unit of knowledge, right? There's this thing that we need to know. We need to know it, understand it, find it, cognize it, fill an information gap, or gain information about it. Again, we're circling around. There's the thing here where I need to know. There's the me, there's the drive, then there's the thing. Now, we framed this at curiosity as nodal acquisition. This is kind of the traditional vision of what curiosity is. You want to acquire something. It's acquisitional in nature. Curiosity is acquisitional in nature when it's traditionally understood. And there's a thing to be acquired. But I think there's some limitations. We think there's some limitations to that framework. So, as a historian, right, of ideas, an intellectual historian, I wanted to ask, what are some buried ways of thinking about curiosity that would differ from that traditional view? Here are some relational definitions that we get across history. So, for example, this is from a medieval educator. With curiosity, some things follow from the finding of others, just as when the beginning of a thread is secured, it's found to be connected with another set of things quite different from those which were being examined. Here, he's proposing that curiosity is this following of a thread. It's not that I have to know something or that there's a thing I must acquire, but rather I need to be good at following. I need to be good at listening. I need to be good at connecting if I'm going to be curious. Or Charles Sanders Peirce says curiosity is stimulated by the rational relations between things. Okay? Curiosity is stimulated. It's not that I have it. It's stimulated in me by relationships in the world. And suddenly I become alive to the relationships in the world. Again, it's not acquisitional here. There's not a thing I'm trying to know. I am being stimulated or coming alive to connections or relations out beyond me. And lastly, John Dewey says knowledge is a perception of those connections of an object which determine its applicability in a given situation. And curiosity drives us to build that connection, right? An ideally perfect knowledge for Dewey would represent such a network of interconnections that any past experience would offer a point of advantage from which to get at problem presented in a new experience. If you're a curious person who's regularly building knowledge, your knowledge is deeply integrated, interconnected with all the other things that you've come to know and come to experience and come to feel. So curiosity, something else is being described in these passages, and this is what a humanist loves to think about, right? What do we see? And so from my vantage point, this was a relational view. But of course, if I'm working with a network neuroscientist, it's a network review, right? But already the person who we had who was just like the single knower, here is a person situated in a social network of lots of knowers, lots of people who are interconnected in building knowledge systems together. The knowledge itself is a set of interconnections that they're trying to find their way around, follow the thread, right? And the world is a system of connections and interconnections or relationships too, right? All the things in the world that we want to come to know are already interrelated in particular ways. So suddenly, each step of curiosity is sort of exploded into this much deeper relational, social, networked view. To put a few more words to that, right? This person is no longer simply like, a monad, to use a philosophical term, some really simplistic view of a person who can be isolated from everything else around them, but they are always a self in relationship to their own self. Like there's some distance, there's things we don't know about ourselves, so there's like a gap in us. It's not like the person is just singular, but there's lots of voices in your head, at least there are in mine. It's a self in relationship to other people, it's a self in relationship to the world, it's a self situated between knowers and between knowledge structures. The knowledge that's getting made is always a set of connections or constellations or links, threads, and then the world itself is full of patterns and networks and ecologies. So this for us is an entirely different frame for curiosity that has not been theorized before, that has not been leaned into before, and we understand it, this frame of curiosity as a kind of building of edges between the nodes. Rather than the acquiring of nodes, we want to build edges between nodes. That's what the curiosity here is. Now the question then followed for me, Okay, so curiosity connects things. But how? Like, how does it do that connecting work? And how could we best talk about it or describe it? Or what stories could we tell about it? So again, as a humanist by training, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into all those old texts. And what I had done in much of my research was just curate, and this is limited to Western intellectual history, but I curated definitions of curiosity by major thinkers in every area of Western intellectual history. But I went back, I said, okay, let's forget those. I went back and I said, what are the descriptions of curiosity? Like when people say a person is curious or an activity or a behavior is curious, what do they describe? Because there's often a disjunction between how things get defined in formalized texts, right, and how we actually tell stories about something. And often the stories point us somewhere richer than the definitions, which had to become hyper-constrained. So one of the things I did was I followed out the word curiosity, again, across this Western intellectual tradition in Greek, Latin, French, German, and English. So notice the limitations, certainly, of those languages. That's the limitations of my own language skills. So there's certainly much more that could be done here. And I looked up where the term itself was used, where synonymous phrases were used, and in some cases where interrogative sentences were used. What became obvious to me was that there were at least 3 different ways of describing curiosity in action. Curiosity as it gets done in the world. Curiosity as it can be storied. So these 3 styles we've called the busybody. So the busybody is someone who loves to collect discrete bits of information, more like that kind of trivia person who we started with at the beginning. But it's not just discrete bits of information, but really this person likes loose knowledge networks, likes to gather information that doesn't have to be really tightly connected. You're like, I know this, and I know this, and I know this, and I kind of know how they go together, but I don't really need to, cinch them. I don't need to know the intimate details of all the ways in which they line up or don't line up, these 2 things, right? The busybody is like, I can handle a loose knowledge network. I like living in that space, gives me room to breathe. The hunter, on the other hand, needs all the cinching, right? Needs to say, all the things I know, I need to know how they work together. I need to know the intimate details of those interconnections. So that person is much more likely to build these really tight knowledge networks. Both of these have strengths. We'll talk about that later. But both styles have strengths here. And then the dancer is someone who is more interested or comes more alive when they're trying to put 2 things together that no one else is really putting together. It's they're the why not person. They're I get really excited, really curious when I get to create, when I get to say, hey, what if I put this together? What happens, right? For myself, that's where it's exciting for me. When I'm working, all of these are important, but when I'm working, when I feel most alive, most curious, most want to know something, it's when I'm trying to build connections that I find unexpected. It doesn't mean necessarily that you will find them unexpected, right? But when I feel that they're unexpected to me, that's when I'm like, wow, I'm in, right? I'm super in. So those are the 3 curiosity styles. And again, over and over again, you can see these being described across century after century after century, across literatures, across languages. It's very fascinating that there would be styles people would come back to without really talking to each other, right, about curiosity. One example, I want to systematize this in just one example before I hand things over to Dani for a moment. Gloria Anzaldúa, who's a Chicana feminist working in the second half of the 20th century, she is a great example of all 3 kinds of curiosity. So you may be more like one than the other. That's perfectly normal. But you may also find yourself resonating with all 3 styles. As for the busybody, she's a busybody when it comes to reading. She describes herself as a reader. I'd read everything in the library, everything. I literally went through all the shelves book by book, right? This was an age in which people hung out in the libraries. But just I will read anything, I'm in, right? Hunter, she describes herself as a hunter more when she's talking about her writing. So that's interesting, that depending on the practice you're engaged in or the behavior you're engaged in, you may lean one way or the other. As a writer, she says, I try to get each section to lock into sync with every other section. lock and pulse together the undercurrent rhythm of the whole piece. Like when it's really integrated, when it's really tight, that's when she's most alive in her writing. But then she kind of uses language of the dancer when she talks about herself as an artist. So she's a reader, she's a writer, and she's also an artist. And she says, I try to construct alternative roads. I try to create new topographies and geographies until everything starts to dance. So she's a great example of all three styles in one. So what do we do with this information? Oh, I should just say, those are three styles. We're convinced there's lots more, right? There's no way in which whatever this, Western intellectual tradition offers to all of us, or my knowledge of that tradition offers to all of us, that can't possibly be the limits of the styles. And we're really interested in what you'll see in the glossary to our book. We're really interested in expanding beyond the human in particular, to thinking of styles of curiosity that are performed and enlivened by other beings in the world.
Great. Okay, so that brings us to the second section of what we wanted to go over today, which is understanding curiosity in the natural and artificial wild. So what I want to do is to think about what Peirce has just described in taking this historical philosophical approach to the study of curiosity and pulling out these three different styles. What I want to do is to take that and say, do we see those in real life in humans today? What kind of evidence do we see for humans engaging in information seeking or curiosity with these different styles? So this is work that was led by David Leiden-Staley, who was a postdoc in my laboratory, and he wanted to study this in an ecologically valid way, if he could, so as sort of real life as possible. So what he did is that he took individual participants and had them browse Wikipedia for a long period of time, and then he studied which pages they moved between and how they built new knowledge in the process. So altogether in this initial study, there were 149 participants. Each of them browsed Wikipedia for over 5 hours over the course of 21 days. And collectively over the 149 people, there were more than 18,000 pages visited. So with that data, we were able to determine how people stepped between pages. So you can think of each page as having a semantic content, and then you can quantify how similar the semantic content is in this page and this page. So how big of a step was that? Did they go between, let's see, pebbles and rocks, for example, or did they go between rhododendrons and the Queen of England? That would be a much larger semantic step. So what you're seeing over here on the right-hand side is three different people. Each person is a column of data, and then the color here indicates how large their step was. So if the similarity between the two pages was high, you would see a more white step, and if the similarity between the two pages was low, you would see a darker step. So what we observe is that this individual, for example, tends to take pretty small steps. They move between pages that are relatively related to one another, whereas this individual walks between pages that are very distinct from one another. So what's interesting about this setup is that then we can take every single step, we can connect it up and quantify the number, the sort of structure of the network that they're walking among. So with that data, we can ask, how would we determine whether one was walking more like a hunter or more like a busybody? And can we see that they're walking in these different ways characterized by their patterns of connections that they're making between the pages? What we did is that we took tools from network science that allow us to quantify the structure of the networks that they are building as they're walking, and then we link that up to the characteristic styles that were just described. So the busybody is somebody who has this drive to jump between ideas. They don't mind the uncertainty of large gaps in the knowledge space. They have this drive to span knowledge and are unfazed by missing information. So the kind of network that they're going to build has these much longer paths in it. In contrast, the hunter is somebody who has a drive to eliminate the unknown, a drive to fill in gaps in knowledge, and is frustrated by missing information. And we can quantify these differences using tools from psychology, so a questionnaire or a scale that helps us to determine where people sit along this spectrum. The hunters in their networks are going to, because they're filling in all these gaps, they're going to create networks that are highly clustered. So the first piece of data that I want to show you is where we we quantified the degree of clustering in the networks that people are creating and their need to fill gaps using this questionnaire from psychology. So here what you're observing is a positive trend. So over here on the right-hand side are the hunters. Those are the ones that have a very strong need to fill gaps, and they also make networks that have higher clustering. In contrast, the busybodies are over here on more of the left-hand side. They have a very little need to fill gaps and tend to build networks that have lower clustering. On the right-hand side, you see a similar effect, but now we're studying how long the paths are. So the busybodies are creating networks with longer paths, and the hunters are creating networks with shorter paths. So what this illustrates to us is that you can see people who are more busybody-like in their browsing of Wikipedia and more hunter-like in their browsing of Wikipedia. And you can also see people who are all in between. So you can tell that there are not two sets of individuals. There's a full distribution across the entire spectrum. There's a continuum. So some people sit kind of in the middle between the two. Some people lean more busybody, some people lean more hunter. But that was an interesting and exciting study for us, but it also was relatively small. So this is a laboratory study of 149 individuals, right, who were in the Philadelphia area. What we wanted to do is to take those initial ideas and those initial findings and expand them out to a much, much larger data set. So to do that, we worked with Martin Gerlach, who is a senior research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation. And he was interested in sharing the data from the Wikimedia Foundation to allow us to study curiosity styles in over 2 million users of the Wiki mobile app. Now, importantly, all of these data were completely anonymized, so we have no information about who these people are. What we do know is the country that they were browsing in and the language of Wikipedia that they were browsing. So the data come from over 50 countries and territories and 14 different languages of Wikipedia. One of the limitations of the previous study was that it was only on the English Wikipedia. The student who led this work was Dale Zhou, who was at the time a graduate student in neuroscience at Penn and is now a postdoc at UC Irvine. What we found in this much larger data set is a recapitulation of the earlier findings, but we also learned some new things. One of the new things that we learned is that busybodies and hunters tend to browse different sorts of topics in the Wikipedia space. So here what you're seeing along the y-axis is the number of articles that are visited in the culture sections of Wikipedia. And then on the x-axis is this continuum from more busybody-like to more hunter-like in their networks. So what we see is that the more busybody-like individuals tend to browse more articles in the culture section, whereas the hunters don't. And I could show you the next piece of data, which is kind of the inverse of this, where we see that hunters tend to read more articles in geography, in history and society, and in STEM topics. So there's this interesting distinction. It's not a binary. It's not that busybodies only browse culture topics, and it's not that hunters only browse STEM topics, but it is a tendency of these two to be browsing in different spaces of Wikipedia. We also observed with this larger data set that busybodies and hunters differ in their browsing diversity. So here along the y-axis is a measure of topic diversity. So how distinct were the topics that they were moving among? And importantly, for those who focus on kind of data science, natural language processing, and similar areas, we had to take a measure of topic diversity that was language agnostic, because we're dealing here with 14 different language Wikipedias. So we worked with a technique that allows us to assess topic diversity across different languages. So here you see this negative relationship in the empirical data in red, where the busybodies are those that are browsing with greater topic diversity, and the hunters are those that are browsing with less topic diversity, consistent with the organizational structure that we've been describing thus far. And finally, we also noticed that busybody and hunter-like curiosity are differently expressed across countries. And in particular, we observed that social equality and two different measures of social equality were associated with more diverse browsing and less hunter-like browsing. So importantly, we found that gender equality in a country is associated with their browsers taking longer paths and using covering more space in a more diverse set of topics. And similarly, education equality is associated with browsing with longer paths and through greater topic diversity. And in contrast, those countries that have more inequality, either in terms of gender or in terms of education, tend to have more hunter-like browsing, less topic diversity, and more clustering. There are many possible reasons for this we can't tell using the data that we have which is driving it. We would not need a lot more information about who the browsers were, which importantly was not data that we had access to. But it is possible that there are patriarchal forces that push curiosity into specific norms that are a little bit more constrained. There are also capitalist constraints, so time needed or allowed for browsing or available for browsing could be different across these countries. Individuals who come to Wikipedia could be coming with very distinct motivations. Maybe they're coming for work, or they're coming for entertainment, or they're coming for something else, more in some countries than in others. And there could also be very different demographics. Who is coming to Wikipedia in the US versus any other country? It's possible, especially when you go across 50 different countries, to have variations in who it is that is choosing to come to Wikipedia and use that for browsing or for work. So that helps us to think now of sort of how curiosity can be thought, not just in terms of a single individual, which is how Peirce described sort of historically it's been thought of, but we can move from people to countries. We can then think about worlds and possibly universes. So it's natural now to turn to a couple slides in maybe astronomy, right? I don't do astronomy, so we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to say, let's expand our minds and think about maybe alternative intelligences, and specifically artificial intelligence. So what we have been doing over the last little while now is to ask, can we design artificial agents who can build knowledge networks with these really different curiosity styles? One way that we can do that is we can give our artificial agents this need to fill gaps, the need that the hunter has to fill all the gaps. We can have artificial agents that have that need and watch them walk through a network space and think about what possible steps they might take next and choose that next step based on how much it's going to close a gap, for example, right? Alternatively, we can build an artificial agent who is going to walk through the same structure and try to build out from there, but it's going to choose a next step that doesn't necessarily fill a gap, but that pushes the frontiers in this really broad, extended way. With those two kinds of, well, the two that I'm describing right now in the paper, we have multiple others as well, but with these different reward structures for what kinds of networks the artificial agents want to build, you can see knowledge being pushed in very different ways. So an interesting question then is how would these kind of artificial agents allow us to think through how knowledge grows over time and maybe how it could grow differently to better support innovation. So where are we going to next with the science part of this investigation? I'd really like to know how we stitch different styles of curiosity together. Peirce mentioned earlier Gloria Anzaldúa, the Chicana feminist, and how she uses different kinds of curiosity styles in different areas of her life. When I think about science, I also think that we use different kinds of curiosity styles at different stages in a project. And what I'd like to do is to ask, when we use these different styles, how do we know when to change the styles? What kinds of networks can we build when we leave some gaps open so that our network structure can change shape or adapt to new information and maybe support some cognitive flexibility versus rigidity? So our ongoing work is attempting to test this theory that we often build in a mosaic of styles. And that supports open-mindedness, changeability of our understanding, intellectual humility, and a growth mindset. All right, so with that, we will turn to
implications for society and social justice, focusing on pedagogy and academia. What do we do with some of this information more practically? We've been talking a lot about knowledge networks or knowledge structures. This is a nice way, think about scaffolding, think about the ways that structures themselves get built. This is happening certainly in all of our disciplines, in all of our minds. But it's also, we need to be thinking not just that there's one knowledge structure, knowledge network in each of us that we're adding little bits to all throughout the day, but that there's actually multiple competing knowledge structures within each of our minds. So we need to get a little bit deeper and muddier there. Think about how many times you might say, I can't believe that I did this, said this, blah, 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 when I believe or I think this, right? Some like, there's like incongruities in myself. Likewise in other people, you might say, wait, I thought you thought or believe or see the world this way, but then you say this or you chose this, or like, how does that match, right? Well, actually, there's incredible complexity to the kind of structures that are within our own minds. So we have to dispense with the presupposition that we're building one cohesive knowledge network in each of our minds. We have to get rid of that. We also need to refuse the illusion that all of us are working together to create the same knowledge structure. Also, right? That humans are building some kind of thing called knowledge together over time. That is also not really reflective of what actually is happening. Instead, there are worlds of knowledge. There are worlds of knowledge in your own head, and there are certainly worlds of knowledge out beyond us in which, importantly, geography, culture, time, change what kind of structures are starting to hang together as knowledge in a given place for a given people. And if that's the case, if all of that complexity is the case, how do we teach? How do we learn? What kind of universities do we want to be nurturing? Just some really two very basic kind of thought experiments here. If students learn differently, it's because students are making connections differently. As educators in a classroom, we need to be thinking about who are the busybodies or the hunters or the dancers in our classrooms. How are students building their knowledge networks, those competing knowledge networks, and navigating the competition of those knowledge networks in their own brains? How are they doing that, right? What are the skills that they have? What are the styles that they have coming into the room? And not just stamp out all the differences and say, hey, this is how we learn this thing. But say, hey, how do we build on the diversity in the room, diversity of knowledge, curiosity styles? We also really need to think, I think we're at a juncture where we need to think about how neurodivergence changes and enriches what we can do in the classroom. I think this is a place where we really are as a culture. We need to think about not teaching to the same kind of mind, with the same kind of capacities, with the same structural connections in the brain, etc. Like that to me, and just a quick shout out, try reading Crip authorship, Disability as a Method, to think about how disability in writing and neurodivergence, particularly in neurotypicality, affect what we can do in a classroom in like an enriching, enlivening, awakening sort of way. Number two, I think there's implications not just for the classroom, but for the curriculum. So if knowledge network structures are really worlds and competing worlds of knowledge, we need to be learning that knowledge as rooted in people and rooted in places. Knowledge is not an abstract thing that we can just universalize and say, hey, this is true for all of us, this makes sense for all of us, this is the way all of us perceive things, right? So we need to cultivate in students and in ourselves this facility with knowledges, plural. I honestly think we could stop talking about knowledge in the singular entirely, and it would be a good thing. Knowledges that are historically and culturally contextualized regardless of discipline. And I think we need to, again, cultivate this ability to appreciate the resonances between those knowledges, but also grapple with the incommensurabilities. If there's anything that this moment of political polarization teaches us, I think it's that we need those skills more well-developed than they are, right? The capacity to appreciate the resonances across worlds of knowledge, but also grapple with the incommensurabilities. We need more skills there.
Beyond pedagogy and the classroom, there are also really important implications for journalism, for media, but also for communication in general. When I think about just writing an email to a colleague or to a student, or when I think about what I discussed over dinner the other night, or when I think about what I write or when I prepare content for others, I think there are some pressing questions we need to ask ourselves or could benefit from asking ourselves. Whose ideas do we engage with? Who do we choose to interview? Who do we solicit input from? Whose arguments do we build on? And who do we make more visible? This is important or related to the question of where knowledge is coming from and how we grapple with it, because if we are taking people with our communication through a trajectory of ideas or a trajectory of arguments or building out a content space, then we have a question of how we are doing that. Are we doing it in this very narrow way that you can see from the light beam here? Or are we pulling in this voice that's sort of counter, or spreading out into this area that complements a mainstream, or showing the diversity of ideas in a particular space and saying, look, actually we need to address all of these at the same time and come up with a way of moving forward together. In addition to communication, I think there are also important implications for how we think about research practice. And this is something that Perry and I have done a lot of research in as well, so we have a separate area of our research together that focuses on how we engage with the scholarship of other individuals in the academy, whether it's in science or in philosophy or any other research area that you're involved with. How do we engage with the ideas of others in this way that spans outward rather than maintaining a very narrow view? I wanted to particularly highlight this work of Keisha Ray. She wrote a paper that we collaborated on. It's called Citation Bias, Diversity, and Ethics, and it's published in the journal Accountability in Research. And there she's asking, how do we cite other scholars? How do we build the reference lists in our papers or our grant proposals or our blog posts? How do we search for prior work that's related to our own? Do we depend upon search systems that are biased in their own ways? How do we practice a diverse curiosity when we think about what work to engage with in our own writing or in our own science or in the humanities? And do we foreground actively an excavation of more marginalized voices?
Lastly, just because of the context in which we are all living and breathing right now, we wanted to end on a note of hope. And interestingly, curiosity has been theorized alongside hope for millennia, which is sort of not really surprising when you say it, but maybe a little bit like, oh, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Curiosity and hope have kind of been companionate concepts throughout history and thought. Thomas Hobbes, for example, wrote, this hope and expectation of future knowledge from anything that happens new and strange is that appetite which we commonly call curiosity. So this hope, this expectation of future knowledge, this is something we commonly call curiosity. Curiosity is driven by hope. What a wonderful kind of frame. And radical pedagogy theorist Paulo Freire writes, curiosity, as a constant movement of search, is in its very nature an expression of hope. Curiosity moves us and sets us patiently impatient before a world that we did not make, to add to it something of our own making. When we think about curiosity, it's not just innovation, newness, success, achievement. There should be something soulful about it, some hope that's driving it. And for each of us, that hope may be different, but perhaps we could collaborate more clearly on what those hopes are. How does this framework, though, get threaded through this kind of network account of curiosity we've been working with before you today? In network theory, there's a notion of the adjacent possible. So what is most possible, most available within a network is the adjacent possible. It's the immediately next edge and node that you can either build or take away or reformulate, right? So the possibilities of a network's growth can be centered in these kind of matrices, adjacent matrices, right around where you are. If curiosity is in fact this capacity to build connections and to build structurally connected networks, then the hope may lie in what is most proximate, what is most immediately to hand, what can I do now? What is right here? You know, if you ever sit in front of a blank page or like, I don't have an idea for the next thing we should do, or like, I don't know what my next step is in my life, often it's really helpful to go back to where am I right now? And what is the most immediately adjacent node or edge that I can lay down or reformulate in my life, that's where movement can really happen. So yes, we want to activate our curiosity. We want to sharpen our hope through that curiosity and sharpen our curiosity through our hopes. And maybe realize that what is most possible is right here where we are and focus there in our steps moving forward.
So with that, we wanted to acknowledge some of the people who were involved in the work that we presented to you here today. I pointed out David, Martin, and Dale earlier, but other people who were involved in related studies that I sort of gestured toward but didn't describe in detail are Dr. Ann Blevins, who was a postdoc in my lab, Shubhankar Patenkar, who's still a graduate student in bioengineering, Jason Kim, who was a graduate student and is now at Cornell University as a postdoc, Chris Lin, who was a graduate student in physics but is now a professor at Yale University, and Matthew Ole, who was a graduate student and is now a postdoc also at Cornell University. We also want to acknowledge the Wikimedia Foundation and also thank MIT Press for supporting us in the development of Curious Minds, which is the book that we wrote together on this topic. So with that, thank you so much for listening. We would love to take questions and et cetera. Yes.
So I think we can sort of array ourselves here. So thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I think the name of the game right now is to do some Q&A.
Great.
I can get the ball rolling, but as I do, I want to invite everyone who's here with us to come up to one of the microphones that's being set up here to ask questions. We would love to get questions for all of you during this kind of little panel discussion period. But let me just get started. So one thing that I wondered as I was listening to your talk about, in the first part about these different styles that people have in wandering around Wikipedia pages, finding different types of knowledge, and then at the end, the sort of structure of knowledge itself. How do you see those as potentially being related to each other? Do we think that different types of knowledge have actually different types of structures, different types of network structures that might make it more advantageous to use one of the curiosity styles to sort of navigate them? Like, does the structure of cultural knowledge sort of lend itself to a busybody exploration? And does the structure of STEM knowledge lend itself to a hunter-style exploration? Or kind of how do you see that interaction between the structure of knowledge itself and the structure of or curiosity styles?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I can definitely describe kind of more proximally what happens in the Wikipedia case, but I don't know then if you want to talk about something more general. So in the Wikipedia case, it is true that the culture pages are differently structured from the STEM pages. So the semantic similarity, the choice by editors of what topics to even write about and then how to hyperlink between them is quite different across these two areas. One of the things that we did in the Wikipedia study is to ask, well, is that a complete explanation of what we observe in human behavior? Or are humans, is the busybody, would they still busybody on STEM pages as well, right? And the answer is, so we can do a statistical analysis where we account for the variance in the local structure of the network. And once we remove that variance, we can see what's left in their tendency for browsing. And what we observe is that there's somebody who has this more busybody-like style, does it consistently across pages, not just in the culture-like sections. Mm-hmm. So that suggests to me that, yes, there could be, both pieces are important. It's important to understand the structure of the knowledge you're walking on or that people are walking on, but also even given that those differences, people themselves have tendencies that are not explained by what they're walking on.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. I think it's really, really important. It's clear to me, as a student of history and culture, that the ways of building knowledge can differ immensely from place to place and time to time. When you're talking across history and across the globe. So the ways of investigating change. The actual practical behaviors and tools that are available can often be quite different. What counts as a good question in each of those settings changes. And so what ends up being built then, and what is seen as like a compelling answer to questions changes. Again, from culture to culture, from time, era to era. So I think that very, very, very clearly our knowledge structures, or our webs of knowledge, or worlds of knowledge, will have discrete kinds of shapes. And I think that we can talk about those in lots of different ways. I think we should think more cohesively about what globalization does to that. I think on the one hand, I think globalization can dull some of the differences in those, how the questions get asked, how they get pursued, how satisfying answers get framed or get recognized, right? I think globalization can dull some of that, but also there's always difference. There's always subcultural niche practices, no matter how international our world gets. Right? And so attending to the relationship between kind of more dominant knowledge structures that may become more and more similar around the globe, attending to that in comparison to more local knowledges where difference and strangeness continues to kind of erupt in different ways, I think is something left for us to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about just the structure of knowledge itself and how it might differ, and how that leads us to ask different kinds of questions to begin with. I mean, speaking of asking, kind of the formulation of asking questions, often I think this is something that we think about a lot with curiosity in general, and certainly with all kinds of academic research and study like we're doing, sort of like, how do we come up with a question to begin with? And how does that relate to something, a kind of situation where you might be more kind of passively, not completely passively, but sort of following the train of one thing to another, like when you're reading a book or browsing the internet, or browsing Wikipedia or whatever. Talk us through how your research into curiosity has it given you any insight into the sort of mechanisms that people use to generate questions and kind of traverse these knowledge spaces?
You want to jump first? No, you can go first. So it's certainly true that we all are acculturated or socialized into asking questions in particular ways, and to asking particular kinds of questions, or to find specific areas questionable. Like those are actually things that are culturally and socially stimulated and taught and passed on for all of us. And that's important. That's a fact of human sociality, right? So when we think that we have a question, a burning question, it often has a lot to do with the questions we've been given already. So I don't think we should take too much credit necessarily for the questions that each of us has. But I think, and I think it's important, it's very important for a human society to be able to have those questions that it agrees are somewhat important, so that it can more cohesively try to answer them together. There's some probably evolutionary benefit there, but I also think that there are things that get lost when narrowing structures for questions continue to get kind of replicated and passed down, and this is what we fund, this is what we ask, this is what we fund, this is what we ask, and to try to break out of that can be really risky. I don't know, for me personally, I try to keep the weird quotient alive. I think if a detail in what I'm studying is really weird, I'll pay more attention to it. Or if the question I think I might ask that no one's going to care about because it's too weird, I'll probably stay with it a little bit longer. Because as much as weird questions may be dead ends, and there may be a reason nobody's asking them, there can be a way in which they can push out a little bit against the force of the stream. And there might be something there with asking.
Yeah, I also think in science, I mean, I don't have a study that we've done on this yet, but just speaking to graduate students and faculty, there are some people who have this style where they want the students to find research questions for their master's degree or their PhD, and they recommend that the students read, you know, everything in this very tiny space, so that they know everything that's been done in that tiny space, and that's very important because you don't want to redo something that somebody else has done. That would waste a lot of time and be sad. But others say, you know, recommend that their students kind of intermix reading in that very focal space with reading in a much wider space, or reading in a field that's unrelated, and even in a single afternoon. Like read a paper that's in molecular neuroscience, and then read a paper that's in mathematical statistics, and then read a paper that's in philosophy. I don't know, and mix it in time, because then your brain is in these, it swirls around for a while, for several hours, right? And so that could be a way of pulling out a weird question from the soup, which you wouldn't get if you were staying in this one space for 6 years, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of speaks to what you were talking about at the very end in terms of applications for education, applications for, you know, it could include higher education, like training researchers and so on. Have you yourselves incorporated any of the sort of ideas that you've thought about during this work on curiosity into your own teaching or your own training of students?
Yeah, I mean, we've both taught curiosity classes, which is itself a little bit of an oxymoron, right? But one of the assignments that I like to do is invite students to keep a curiosity journal, to notice when they feel curious, to notice what the questions are that are floating through their mind that are kind of nagging at them. And what's really remarkable for me as an educator is to notice with them, like this is something the students also notice, how much their own capacity to ask questions or to get caught up in something gets kind of suppressed or pushed to the side because of what the questions they need to ask for their classes, or the questions that they need to answer for their research. There's a kind of the established projects that require success are already quite demanding, and so the curiosity journal either sometimes it collapses into the thing I have to ask, the questions I have to ask, you know, or sometimes it can be just very peripheral and say, wow, you know, I haven't felt really curious this week. I've been really busy, but I haven't felt really curious this week. And I think we should notice that as educators and people in the university, right? If our students can struggle with feeling curiosity because of the kind of focused work. I don't know what that cost is there. That's one thing I do.
Yeah.
A question, please.
Am I allowed to just, okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the great talk. I kind of want to bounce off what you had just said about students.
Great.
So I mentor a lot of undergraduate students on research projects, and something that I notice is, right, that they are more driven towards like, I need to finish this for class than I'm openly curious and excited to work on this thing, right? Because they don't have time. They're like so constrained by the things that they have to do that they're not excited to just like go outside and be like, there's this bug or there's this tree, right? And I find myself not knowing how to like give them advice because I find myself very conflicted because I like love curiosity and I'm all about it. And I want them to just follow the thing that they're curious about and follow the thing they're passionate about, but then they also want to get into grad school, right? And to get into grad school, there's like a set of criteria that they have to meet that might not necessarily be aligned with curiosity. So I was just wondering if you have any advice on how I could advise a student in this situation.
Do you want to?
I think you can, I think balancing, helping them to know that in life, we often have to balance time for curiosity and time for getting things done that need to get done. So that seems like a practical skill that they will need to have. But I also think that what you're describing, for me, raises the question of how instructors and faculty and graduate systems and universities can maybe change the way that we are asking students to show us what they know. So for example, one of the things I was going to describe in response to your question is, in one of my classes, I want the students to show me that they understand what we've covered in the class, but I want them to show me in a way that engages their curiosity most deeply. And so I tell them, you can show me what you know with a sculpture, or with photojournalism, or with a Victorian poem that you write in the style of Victorian poems, or a research article, because that's what you're excited about. Like, show me what you know, but do it in the language that gets you excited. So I think the more that we as evaluators can think of incorporating that openness to them showing us in the way that is most engaging to them, I think would be great. I think it would pull so much life from all of us. I think we would all be like, oh yeah, I will do that. If you give me that freedom, I will show you that I know this inside and outside and backwards and upside down and everything else, you know?
I also think that I think it's really important, especially as a mentor of students who are conducting research. I think it's important to encourage kind of a healthy, I want to say dissociation, but maybe I mean distance, I don't know. But a healthy dissociation or distance from the way the discipline is working right now, or the way that research works, or the way that the academy works. It hasn't always worked this way. I think that researchers who really push the world and of ideas have this kind of healthy distance or healthy dissociation that says, okay, that might be how we do it, or how you do it, but I'm not always going to do it that way, right? And I think that the dissociation or the distance matters because we can come to believe that that's what good work is. That's what excellent work is. It's the way I've been told to do it, instead of the way that drives me. And sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not true, right? And I think that the emphasis on greater diversity of experimentation with what a given mind can do, I mean, I want that. What can your mind do? Show me that. And sometimes that can be terrifying for students. Like the fact that an undergraduate can look at me and look panicked when I say, just show me your mind, you know? It's because they don't know how to access it. In a way, some folks haven't been invited to access what their mind can do and where their mind leads them. And so I think we need a lot for us as curiosity researchers. We need more space for that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Great talk, thanks. I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first one is sort of empirical. You introduced this hunter versus busybody versus dancer versus question mark additional types of curiosity. But in the Wikipedia study, we only talked about the hunter and the busybody. I was just kind of curious how the dancer fits into that framework.
Yeah. So we did not study the dancer in the first paper, which was with the 149 participants in Philadelphia. But when we moved to the larger scale data set of the 2 million users from the Wikimedia Foundation, we also had some much longer browsing periods over the course of several months. And so that allows us to use the math that we needed to use to say, like, what is the history of where this person is coming from? And then can we see the leap that stitches together these unexpected areas? So we needed basically a time lag in the data that would allow us to fit the models. We were able to do that in the Wikipedia study. So I didn't mention it here today, but in the paper, we have a whole section on the dancer.
Cool, thank you. And my second question, I'm not sure if this is extremely well posed, but I'm curious how you see the relationship between like establishing knowledge networks and decision making, because I have found in my personal life, like, two people can agree on a set of facts and like align in their knowledge networks and then come to completely different decisions about whatever the state of the world is. So, and maybe like particularly from like a network theory lens, how does knowledge network translate into decision making?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the simplest way that these two things connect is that we each have a decision from where we sit in knowledge space to where we want to step next, right? So both the little artificial agents that we build have a choice of where they're going to step next. So we have a decision rule for them that depends on what kind of network they're trying to build. But for humans too, if we're foregrounding hope and going to take one of those adjacent possible steps rather than trying to leap somewhere completely different or backtrack. But so that's a place where it can go. I think another thing that comes to mind is that in addition to knowledge having a structure of facts, there's also a structure of values and principles and preferences and hopes. Like, what is it that where are we trying to go? And those are additional, I think, guides or maybe additional nodes in the network or a different layer of the network that's influencing how we think through the facts. So that's another place where it could fit into the model.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thanks for that great talk. I'm a cognitive psychologist, cognitive scientist. I teach here at BU in the psychology department. And I've long been curious about how people come to have their interests. And it's actually not a well-studied area. I mean, not setting aside your book, it sort of in the individual differences literature, it's you know, people talk about like market needs, like the need to corner the market or sort of that type of thing. But I've actually been thinking about it in a way very similar to what you're doing, although not from the Wikipedia network perspective. I've been thinking of it as an individual differences variable in terms of what I call grain size of the interest. So the large grain size would be, I'm sort of thinking of grain size, think a little bit of receptive fields, neural receptive fields, like how much is your microscope or your binocular view on the world, how big an area is it covering? So if we think about something like the humanities or poetry or political philosophy, you really need to have a very big picture view of what's going on in the world, whereas this very small grain size would be algorithmic, computer programming, some types of music, math. And so my idea is that humans have what I call the cognitive comfort zone. So where on a spectrum, which looks kind of similar to the busybody, to the hunter, the fine grain size to the large grain size, like I think of it as your cognitive comfort zone. So people have a brain that has a certain style, and we find certain interests, we find certain topics attractive because they fit our cognitive comfort zone. And so for some reasons, for some part, I don't actually have a question. I'm more actually just sharing with you that there is this sort of individual differences way of looking at it, and it does sort of map onto a little bit of what you're saying here. But so some of the questions that I'm sort of curious that I've tried to do, whether maybe you can shed some light, would be like developmentally, you know, how does this cognitive comfort zone emerge? You know, how neuroscience-y, how based is it on like dendritic branching, like long range fibers versus a dense bushy tree? I just want to know if you've ever sort of gone, how far you've gone in your own interest to the sort of individual differences, like how does someone decide to be a poet versus a computer programmer?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially when they have the same DNA. It's a really good question.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Who knows? Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I really love this connection between the grain size and maybe the step size that people are using when they're browsing or seeking for information. I would love to think about that more. One of the things that we have noted, or I think one of the ways of thinking through the network approach that is complementary to that is that people can have a certain step size irrespective of the content space, right? So, and even our artificial agents can take big steps or small steps irrespective of the content space they're in. So it's that the network approach here is foregrounding that it's possible to have something feel good in its step size, independent from whether it's in the humanities or the sciences or sports or something else. So I think what this makes me think of is maybe we have two pieces of curiosity, one being the interest, what is it that we're interested in? And then what are the movements that we like to make in knowledge spaces? And sometimes those two align. So the extreme busybodies that only step in the culture spaces, maybe for example, but in other cases they may mix and match, and we'll be more of a hunter in a humanities space or in a culture space, or we'll be more of something else in some other space. And so I sort of wonder whether, I would like to better understand whether these two pieces of a person are independent at the individual differences level, right? Or if they influence one another and maybe differently for different people. Maybe for some people they are completely independent and for others they're not. And did that happen through development? Maybe, based on maybe their experiences or what they were exposed to. I don't know.
Well, and I would also add, if we think about poetry, we can have something like iambic pentameter. We can have something that's incredibly rule-driven and governed, and then we can have freestyle. There's just because it's poetry doesn't actually mean that it's busybody style. And I also think there's something about I think we've found in working together that there are ways in which our brains work where we just drill down and get lost in these very, very, very intimate details of our own fields. And then there's a need that we also share for this much broader risk-taking thinking. And we've found in both of our fields that can be frustrating to have both of those capacities and needs as researchers. It's sort of, it can be more well supported if you're one or the other of those in a given field.
Thanks for the talk. It was very informative. I guess the prologue to my question is that a lot of the knowledge that one will decide to seek out is often heavily influenced by the foundational beliefs of the individual. So for example, like your beliefs about epistemology and what counts as valid forms of evidence. And many of these beliefs are often quite arbitrary between cultures. So I was just wondering that in your lives and research, do you ever explore different epistemological frameworks when deciding on what to explore and how to construct knowledge?
I mean, I think that there are, we mentioned worlds of knowledge, but there are these places that are relatively epistemically cohesive, right? In which a lot of work and a lot of thought has been done, and that's the case in I think any field or any discipline. I mean, science broadly construed it doesn't share the same epistemic constraints all the way throughout history, right? You need to actually be thinking a where and a when to figure out the confines of any epistemic kind of theoretical space. And yeah, do we think about those specificities? Sure. I think that as you come to know and become an expert in a particular framework, yeah, you have to pay attention to those differences, but then also branch out. I know you got lost somewhere in the Royal Society papers from the 1600s or something, and thought, science is wild sometimes.
Yeah, and it has changed significantly. I think a related, as you were speaking, one of the things that I was realizing or thinking about is that in science, it's very much often believed that scientists are, perfectly objective humans, practically robots, right? Because we've been trained for a very long period of time to think very clearly, to study the facts, to have strong hypotheses and test them clearly, and then report our results with perfect objectivity, right? And one of the interesting complementary views is that, in fact, there's a lot of evidence for imperfections in human perception, that can impact, what are the questions that we're looking for? What is the data that we noticed or observed? Where was our attention being focused? And how did that impact the information that we took in and then made decisions about maybe, or built a new experiment around? And so the humanness that we all bring to science is another way of thinking. It is an experiential kind of knowledge that we all bring to science and that influences science. And so I think one of these places where bringing in two kinds of knowledge that you're describing needs to happen in science, where we understand that the scientific method helps us to be objective, and we have to recognize that we're still bringing this biophysical body that's got all kinds of additional constraints on it, that are including social constraints and relational constraints, and hopes that can influence what kind of science actually gets done. So I think more needs to be done there, and I think it has important implications for whose voices in science eventually get really heard. That's another topic of conversation.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I brought the topic up was because I feel like nowadays it's very easy for people to kind of like discredit and kind of consider people like crackpots who want to go and develop like new fields based on somewhat different foundational beliefs. But like, because I've done some study into like history of science, and I've read like Novum Organum by Sir Francis Bacon, he was very influential in the founding of like the Royal Society. I've seen that a lot of like the foundational beliefs which led to like the establishment of science were pretty far out there in terms of like Hermeticism and like religious beliefs. So yeah, I guess I just brought up the question to see if you incorporated that in your personal like lives, like looking at different like frameworks to kind of like not just discredit like a potential like new field of like knowledge creation. But thank you for your answers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zurn and Dr. Bassett, for your fantastic and wonderful discussion, as well as the talk. I think it could be said that we're in a bit of an epistemological crisis, or maybe that we have been for a little bit. And I think that sometimes we might need stories which acknowledge the joint value of both STEM and the humanities, or the busybody and hunter kind of interpretations. I think that you both explore these different knowledge networks, and there's this compressive function that you serve together that creates, edges at the joint intersection of those two networks where we can derive great value in applying that elsewhere. As a formidable pair of sibling academics, I think you demonstrate the value of philosophizing and integrating both the sciences with the humanities. I was wondering if you could elaborate and maybe tell us your perspective on your relationship with each other working together, and what that can tell us as a story about the value of both science and humanities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We love talking about ourselves.
I did want to say something about where the study of curiosity was in neuroscience at the time that we started talking. So there was a great review article that was written by Celeste Kidd and Benjamin Hayden called The Neuroscience and Psychology of Curiosity. And in that paper, the two authors describe various studies of curiosity and various definitions of curiosity. And at the very end, they say, well, a lot of the studies don't agree with one another. We're not really sure what curiosity actually is. It might be just much too early to even try to define it. So we can keep building experiments, and maybe eventually we'll be able to define it, but right now it's maybe too early. And as a scientist reading that, first of all, it's very freeing. It's like, okay, so there's no definition of curiosity right now. Could be anything. And it's also kind of devastating, because how can you be a scientist when you don't know what you're studying, right? So it was at that point that we started talking, and I thought, or we both thought, or together we thought, it's possible that another discipline could bring in a definition or a structure to the study of curiosity that would really push science in a new way and allow us to ask questions differently, because we're kind of stuck right now in this area. So when Peirce did his evaluation of the different styles of curiosity, I thought, great, it's organized, it's testable, it maps directly onto network phenotypes. we can study this. And that was great. So basically philosophy came in at a time where science was a little stuck. So that's one way in which I think bringing them together is really helpful, just having looking at the problem from a really different vantage point.
Yeah, and I think it's, we do cross-circulate in the sciences and humanities a little bit, but primarily you're surrounded by scientists who often dismiss humanistic knowledge.
Yes.
I remember talking to a scientist who said something about like, well, you just write review papers. I was like, well, that's not actually what I do. So in science, review papers try to just summarize what the literature that's available at the time, right? And I'm like, no, actually, I create ideas that you can then use if you want. But so there's that on the sciences side, and then on the humanities side, there's just this sort of there can be a real dismissal and sort of a hurt feelings, like science gets all the attention and all the money, and there's no one at the helm. It's just science is going and creating these things that might devastate the world. And if they would just talk to the humanists, maybe they would have like a soul and an ethics, and so that's the perspective of the humanists generally. There's not a lot of good feeling, I think, across the aisle there among a particular section of people. But so for us, but obviously we liked each other to begin with. So that was an important step. Important step. We've talked to a lot of siblings talking about this book, and they've said, I would never write with my sibling. And I can understand that with some, we also have other siblings, but this was absolutely a delightful process. And the actual process itself, I just want to mention, involves, on the one hand, reading each other's work a little bit, right? Reading each other's work and reading what that person recommends. Like if we're going to write about this thing together, read this that I've done, read this that I've done, and then read this or this or this in my field, just to kind of like get your mind in a new place, so that then we can start to build these connections and these webs across the lake, So it takes some patience and some willingness to not just bring what we already had pre-made, right? This was very collaborative. It was very generative for both of us as a process.
Yeah, it went over about 6 years, and we published 20 or 30 papers together in the process as we were putting our heads together. So, and that's then eventually the book came out. But we had the idea for the book earlier, but we needed to actually work through how our fields mesh before we could get it down on paper.
Hi, thank you. That was a really interesting talk. In a way, the question that I was thinking of is related to a previous question about epistemology. So I'm particularly interested in the part where you discuss the vocabulary of referring to knowledge in the plural form of knowledges. I wonder if framing knowledge as multiple and parallel knowledges risks reinforcing a hierarchy amongst them. In contrast, thinking of knowledge as a singular yet dynamic and expansive entity might encourage a more integrative, open approach, as you've been discussing. So for me particularly, I think if I think of knowledge as a singular, it allows me to better recognize and engage with its inherent complexity. An alternative way I could think of that is if I conceptualize the network of knowledge as a unit, it might allow greater cooperation between diverse traditions of curiosity.
I appreciate that challenge to my suggestion that we shift to using knowledge in the plural. I understand that knowledge in the plural could leave us washing our hands and say, well, that's that set of knowledge over there, there's this set of knowledge over there, and they're just separate knowledge worlds. I'm sorry. I understand that risk. But there is also this risk when we talk about things in the singular that there's already a built-in hierarchy. That when we say knowledge, what jumps to mind, what gets activated, is a dominant knowledge formation that is dominant because of typically funding or wealth, country wealth, or something like this, military power, etc. So simply using the singular knowledge does not get us out of hierarchies. Usually it hides them from view. So I wonder if there's a way to I would still lean toward using knowledge in the plural, but we would have to think about how to think of the interrelationship between those knowledge networks, which I mean, network science certainly gives us lots of tools to talk about different networks that are interrelating and superimposed.
So this seems like a wonderful place to stop for the evening. I wanted to thank our speakers, Professor Bassett and Professor Zurn, for a wonderful and inspiring talk, and also Professor Dennison for facilitating the conversation and introducing the evening. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I invite you to submit nominations for next year's lecture series. You'll find on the tables as you exit a QR code that you can use with your phone and submit nominations. So thank you.